Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, and anybody that joins in is obviously most welcome. My name is Scott Munden. I'm with Huntley Group. Welcome, and thanks for joining us this morning. We have one primary objective today, which is to improve or increase or create a sense of urgency around having a better security awareness program and or policy within your organization. We're going to talk about the landscape. In other words, the different types of threats that are out there. We're going to go into a little bit more detail on some of the specific things and then what to look for. And then finally, we're going to wrap that up with some very specific examples of creating a security program. And we're going to always encourage you, regardless of where you are in your security journey, we're going to always encourage you to stay focused and to sustain the effort that you have related to your program. So again, a couple of housekeeping items. The chat should be open. So if you have a question while we're presenting, and I'm just want to make sure you can actually see my screen here. If you have questions while we're making the presentation, post them into the chat, and then we've left time at the end for Q&A. Also, this is being recorded, so when we're finished, we'll post a YouTube link and send it out to you so you can all view that. I'd also let you know that huntley.com/video and huntley.com/blog, we're frequently posting information not necessarily related just to security awareness, but other cybersecurity topics. Those are always available to you, so we would encourage you to go out and look. So let's talk about a little bit about the threat landscape. So, and I'm going to give you some factoids here. Roughly 90% of cyber attacks are going to come through what's called unforced errors, and the majority of those are human errors. I'll get more specific in a minute. But the impact of that is significant, and you'll see why. We'll talk about a few of the higher profile things that most of you have probably heard of, a few that you may have not, but then we'll discuss more specifically. Then we're going to look at what things you need to be aware of, and what are kind of the signs. Most businesses under 500 employees, unfortunately, they either don't have a cybersecurity budget, or that's like 49%, and then 51% of them don't have any significant security measures in place. And as we already mentioned, if 90% of the attacks are coming through these unforced errors, and those take the form of phishing attacks or weak passwords, incorrect or not applied patches in software, social engineering, which I'll mention in a little bit, those are the main ones. And if we know that 90% of the attacks are coming in that way, then your best defense is to be aware, because there's no 100% fix to this. However, I attended a conference in Barcelona several years back, and they had the head of MasterCard security there. And he basically made a comment. He said, hackers are lazy, especially the non-institutional hackers. They're going to take the path of least resistance, and they can go find all the published vulnerabilities, and now they can also find how to exploit those vulnerabilities. So they're going to take a path of least resistance. So if you're building up awareness in your organization, you probably are going to be second tier or third tier, because they're going to find the easiest way to get in, and then they're going to move on. It's becoming more sophisticated, the phishing attacks and the malware, as we're going to discuss in a minute. But the more that you ingrain that into your team, and how important it is to be aware, you're at least ahead of the curve compared to most, as I mentioned. I put a few high profile up here. There's a couple others more recently, like United Healthcare. I'm sure many of you heard of that. The Mr. Cooper breach on the mortgage side. The Sony one is interesting because right now, and it's not done, right now the estimates are that the cost of that breach is over $100 million. So for small businesses, and you'll see that in a second, the average cost is around $3 million if you're breached. Depending on your industry, if you're in a regulated industry like healthcare, for instance, the average cost is more like $10 million for a breach. And remember, I said a big chunk of these are not large organizations, not large enterprises. They're 500 or smaller. So the costs are still significant. Some of you may have heard of MOVEit. MOVEit is more on the Apple side of the house. It's a file transfer type of product, but it's used significantly. And you can see here where just how many of those how many companies were impacted. So when we think about our own internal environment, unfortunately, it's just not that way anymore because our organization works with other companies. We have vendors, we have suppliers, we have all different companies that we're working with. And if they get breached, chances are we could get breached. And you may not realize it or not, but 87% of the small businesses actually have data that would be considered private data that could be exposed as a result of it. The other one, and it kind of makes my point about the sort of horizontal and vertical way that these things can impact on a wide scale across an entire ecosystem, was the 3CX supply chain attack. And they're still trying to measure the impact of that. The estimates are astronomical in terms of the total cost, but if it's your business that was impacted, it affects you directly, right? So regardless of the global impact, and it was global, it's going to impact your business. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. So again, I mentioned, so SAP is one of the largest software companies in the world. When they had their breach, you're talking about 95 million records, which is roughly a third of the population of the United States. So, and you don't know, you simply don't know how much data was taken, how much of that was sold and is available on the dark web, what the impact might be a year or 2 or 3 from now, and what the impact is on them, both financially and reputation-wise. So all of this kind of underscores that regardless of where you're at in kind of your security journey, we're all vulnerable. And there's no 100% protection against those vulnerabilities. But as I mentioned, and we want to create that sense of urgency regarding security awareness, because if you are ahead of the curve, and if you're ingraining that in, and at the end of the presentation, we'll discuss what the impact of security awareness programs are. So if you started out where 80% of the people in your organization were pressing phishing links when you got audited, by implementing a program, you reduce that down to 20%. Well, it's not perfect, but it's a significant improvement, and it dramatically decreases your vulnerability landscape. Okay, so here's what I was talking about before. If you take a look at the reality on the ground, is most companies under 500 really don't budget for cybersecurity. They probably have an IT budget, or they have an allocation for IT, but it's not specifically designed for cybersecurity. In a previous webinar, when we were talking about cyber insurance and what some of the regulatory requirements and compliance requirements were going to be, some of those things are forced on you depending on what you're doing, what industry you're in, and whether you're trying to get insurance and things like that. But a lot of those companies are always asking the same question, which is, okay, I'm spending money, but I really don't know if the money I'm spending is being spent in the right place. That's why, again, we go back to security awareness. If you start there, and there are some tools, but more importantly, it's kind of a holistic approach. You create a baseline for not just understanding what your appetite for risk is, but also where your vulnerabilities really are, so you actually know how to apply the appropriate amount of resources. I mentioned again, and I want to emphasize it. So if we know that the average cost of a breach is around $3 million, Most businesses under 500 people, I usually ask the question, if your production system went down for 27 days, which is the average downtime based on a breach, what impact would that have? Well, there's the short-term impact. Some of them will immediately go crazy and say, I wouldn't survive. But let's assume you did survive. A large percentage of those businesses within a year they'll be out of business. The legal costs, the lost revenue because customers will go away, the reputational cost, it's devastating to the business. So again, emphasizing, where do I start? What do I need to do? Starts with awareness. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of the meat of this, the different types of phishing. We'll start with phishing, and then we'll talk about ransomware. The most common is obviously the email phishing, and I'm sure you all get the spam emails. You all get emails with links in there, and we're constantly being told or educated on, please don't press links, please don't open any documents unless you know it's from a secured source. And even then, make sure you look at the URL, the link, where it came from, and look closely, because sometimes the link will say Scott Munden, but they changed one letter in the link. So you don't just immediately pick it up. You have to really look close. The second type is spear phishing, and this is essentially the same, but it's targeted within the organization. So they're looking to mimic something from HR or something from a department within the company, and trying to target specifically within an organization, but it's the same concept. Whaling, it's not Las Vegas gambling, but it's similar, where they're targeting executives. They may even be impersonating executives, either by voice or by email. Smishing is similar, but it's with SMS or text messages. Okay, so I'm hearing that you can't see my slide changing, so apologize for that. Let me try to start and reshare again. So hopefully you can see we should be on the slide that shows the types of phishing. Shanti, could you just confirm quickly for me? Okay, great. Appreciate that. Thanks for letting me know, Shanti. I'm going on and okay. So I mentioned whaling, and that's really targeting your executives, and that's through impersonation or likeness to try to trick you into doing something, especially an executive, because a lot of times they're the most vulnerable. Smishing, which is the same concept, only using text messaging instead of emails. Vishing is a voicemail. And then farming, which is, you may or may not have heard of, but farming is again where they're actually trying to or attempting to compromise your entire email system at the enterprise level. Let me run down through the and let me pause for a minute, because for those of you it wasn't following the slides, that'll be part of what gets sent out to you afterwards. So apologies that you couldn't follow along. But you'll be getting a copy of this as well. So the most common types of ransomware. So remember, we said phishing and ransomware are the two top areas where you're the most vulnerable. And let's go with the top 6 types of ransomware that are used. There are more, and it's evolving all the time. Crypto ransomware is where they're basically going to encrypt your data, and they're going to ask you to pay to get the decryption key to basically unlock your data. Locker ransomware is basically how it sounds. It's essentially going to lock you out of your system, and then you're going to have to pay to get the unlock key. Scareware is where they basically put rogue security software on your system, and you'll get a message that says, hey, we've detected a bunch of threats on your environment. Click here to get the full version so we can clean it up for you. You may or may not have seen that, but it's very frequent. Doxware is where they capture the data and it actually encrypts it, but then they threaten to expose that data. So they've taken your data and encrypted it, and then they've threatened to expose that out publicly. Ransomware as a service is where they breach you, and then they sell that basically they've developed a ransomware software, and then they sell that, they make that available on the dark web for sale. So for people that are maybe they're hackers, they have ill intent, so to speak, but they're not necessarily well versed in how to create ransomware. They can actually go buy that as a service on the dark web. And then the final one, double extortion. So they're going to encrypt your data and force you to pay to get the unlock key. And then they're going to ask you to pay again to not expose the data that they've taken from you. So all of those are pretty scary. And I think you've maybe either heard and or experienced that before. And it can go everywhere from tricking someone into transferring money to the wrong account, basically stealing your money, all the way to crippling your organization where your systems you can't operate. So unless you pay the ransomware, or unless you have a security plan in place to recover. And remember, I mentioned that the average is about 27 days, assuming you had a backup plan or a continuity resilience plan. It's about 27 days. Just to give you an indication, they even have stats on what the cost is. If you fix it within 200 days, you usually end up spending $1 million less than if it's more than 200 days. So the $1 million by itself is significant, but the fact that they mentioned 200 days, so more than 6 months that it took, and obviously beyond that, because as I mentioned at the front end, there are companies that are still going through. There were some financial breaches going all the way back to 2015 that are still being litigated, so they may not recover. They continue to do business. Their business has dwindled and or decreased versus increasing, obviously, but the impact is in years. And if you're in a regulated industry, you've got the fines, you've got the legal fees. So even if you have insurance, there's really no way to protect yourself financially from the long-term effects of that, right? Okay, so what do we really want to be looking for? What would be the signs in general? There are more significant impacts if it's a system-wide event, but obviously any unusual activity, if you're getting notifications for prompting you using multi-factor authentication, you get a prompt to enter a code, which you weren't logging into the system, or you're getting messages about failed login attempts and things like that. That's usually a sign that either somebody's trying to get in or trying to convince you to hand over your credentials, or they're already in. If your system slows down for an unusual reason, I mean, if you're running programs and sometimes the internet is slow, that may be normal. But if your system is slowing down unusually, that may be an indication that you've got a problem. If you start to see unexpected installs of software on your system or on your network, that's also an indication that something's there. And that's something we'll talk about it in a minute, but that's something that you want to look closely at, because I mentioned when I was discussing MasterCard, I mentioned that the easiest way for them to get in is to exploit vulnerabilities. And the vulnerabilities are based on certain versions of software, either your web, even your browser, or certain versions of software that you may be running on your platform. And what they do is they know that this version has a certain vulnerability. They know how to exploit that vulnerability. So if you're not staying current and you're not doing the things to manage that, because that should be a process, right? If you're not doing things to manage that, you're definitely going to be more vulnerable. And then finally, if you're starting to see weird behavior, your system is crashing more, or you're starting to get more errors, probably time to take a closer look. Okay, so at the beginning, we discussed what's the real outcome we're kind of looking for. So that's all scary. It's real. It's actually growing rapidly. So the threat vectors, the threat landscape is only increasing. It's not decreasing. The good news is the protection is also getting better as well. So if you look at some of the statistics, year over year, the attacks continue to increase. However, there's certain types of attacks, because of companies implementing policies and the tools that are available to them to implement, you're actually seeing certain types of attacks trend down. They're still up year over year, but they're trending downward. So there's bad news. It's not going away. Good news is there's hope from that perspective. So the first and best defense is your awareness and educating employees on hygiene, basically cyber hygiene, we call it. And that's everything you do, from onboarding an employee, managing who has access to what, but what the employees do in terms of email etiquette, data privacy, and that's both on the computer as well as physical. I'm sure that if we took a tour of 100 businesses and we walked through all the offices and we turned over the keyboards, we would find at least a percentage of people have their password on a sticky note underneath the keyboard, right? So it's both the physical protection of data as well as on the computers, making sure that your systems are regularly updated. I already mentioned that all of the exploits, the vulnerabilities of software, and that's everything from Microsoft, as we heard recently, even Microsoft had been breached, all the way down to some computer program you may run on your system. Those exploits are published out on the web. So companies will work rapidly to patch their vulnerabilities. So you need to stay current and you need to be scanning consistently. But you need to have a program for managing that. And most of those vulnerabilities are published. And I already mentioned they're published for the bad guys, but they're also published for you. So if you create an awareness program with the technical team, the IT team, the cybersecurity team, as well as with your employees, what should they be looking for? Verify before you trust. If I get an email from HR telling me I need to update my banking details, or they're throwing a going away party for Joe, and I need to, we're all putting money into a pool, make a phone call. Verify the information it was sent from a valid source before you actually trust that source. Certainly anything from the outside, be looking at that and be looking at it closely. As I mentioned, it's very sophisticated. The domain may look exactly or pretty close with maybe one letter changed. Maybe they added an S to the end or something like that. So be creating those awareness programs, and we're going to talk about how to sustain that. Make sure you're doing backups. And I would add a caution here, because if I back up my system and there's been a vulnerability in my platform for 2 months and I didn't know it, because they're just kind of tracking your data, figuring out who's who, so they can decide the best way to exploit you. If I have a backup from a week ago, then most likely that backup has the vulnerability already there. So if I restore from that, I didn't really solve my problem. So your backup strategy has to include, some offsite and some verification, so that if you do reach that situation and you have to restore, your program is in place where it's definitely not going to be painless, but at least you can be confident that and by the way, that's software and hardware, because your hardware can be infected as well. So having that backed up regularly and then verified is critical path. And I already mentioned and you're taking a great step today by just staying aware of what the vulnerabilities that are out there, what they are, who's doing what to whom. You don't have to be a cyber expert. In fact, it's just too overwhelming to try to be an expert in all those things. But the most important vulnerabilities are published. And whether you have a one-person IT shop or a 10-person IT shop, that can be part of their program, is to just stay on top of published vulnerabilities. The government publishes them, and most companies publish vulnerabilities on a regular basis. So you can map that back to the different software that you're using and ensure that you're staying current. Okay, so let's talk about the awareness program. And I mentioned it's more than just technology, because technology, if you're not doing things in a proper way, or you're assuming the technology is taking care of everything, you're probably just doing bad things faster, or you're really not creating an environment where 90% of those errors, those unforced errors, are really being addressed, because the tool is going to help prevent some of that. But as I mentioned, even in environments with security awareness programs, 20% of the employees are still pressing on phishing links. So you're not going to get to the 100%, but your objective is to create an awareness and a policy around that's going to get you to a better level of defense than those that are doing nothing. And so there's essential policies. There's the role of training. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the employee engagement. And I have a couple of case studies. The one most important, and if you've been a victim, then you know, or you've probably been also a victim of the blame culture. But what is your strategy for participation? And what we mean by that is, how do I get people engaged? Because this is ongoing, right? It's not a one and done scenario. So if I'm rolling out phishing campaigns and I've got this security awareness, how do I make sure that people are actually doing the 4-minute monthly video, or they're part of the phishing campaign and they're consistently pressing on links that are on phishing links that are sent out as part of the campaign to help people become aware? How do you strategically get people involved? And I had mentioned at the beginning that most of you probably have been exposed to quality programs or safety first programs. It's a culture that you're building. There's no light switch. It's something that you have to start building over time, and you have to be consistent. You can't say this is the program. We've all been there where, there's a new initiative, and we know that if we just kind of ride the wave for 90 days, it'll go away and we'll be on to the next initiative. This is something that you have to sustain over time. And I mentioned the no blame culture because stuff will happen. It's really not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so if someone made a mistake, obviously there's always consequences of a mistake, but it's not about blaming people, because whether we like it or not, we've probably all been victims. In fact, I'll mention when we do a scan, you'll be surprised to find out that a lot of the people in the organization, their credentials, and maybe their old credentials from 5 years ago, that those are available on the dark web. So it's never productive to kind of have that blame culture. Who's responsible for this? And let's deal with that issue, and then we move on. No, this is creating a strategic culture of awareness. It's going to get people more engaged. You can create incentives. You can have fun with it. But over time, what you're trying to do is build a culture of verify and trust, and a culture of awareness. Some of the essential policies, acceptable use policy, and this is part of that indoctrination when people get onboarded and the ongoing education. If you work in the government, you're probably required every 6 months to go through what they call an OPSEC briefing, operational security briefing. These are awareness sessions that they do, but that includes acceptable use. And what we mean by that is what's acceptable use of your computer in the business environment, the access control policy, who has access to what and why. And that should be in the form of a matrix by function and then by role. An incident response plan. We have a lot of information online available about developing an incident response plan, but in the event that something happens, how are you going to respond? And my strong recommendation is that you don't wait to find out how you'll respond, because it's usually a fire drill. But at least if you have an incident response plan, you've got a path and you can test against that path. For those of you that have cyber insurance, technically that's supposed to be there, and technically you're supposed to be doing what's called a tabletop exercise, which is kind of a simulation at least twice a year. The remote work policy and also the bring your own device policy. So the world has changed. The remote work is much more prevalent, and it doesn't appear it's kind of sitting around that 50% mark. And that appears to be where it's at least it's been that way for the past 18 months and is projected to be that way for the next 18 months, depending on your environment. That may or may not be the case. But what specifically is the policy as it relates to accessing the company's environment, as well as your bring your own device, including mobile devices? So if I'm going to plug my laptop, my personal laptop, into the network, it's either a no-no or these are the requirements for your system to be able to plug into our network. As you can see, you're creating kind of a framework for how this is going to come together and what you want to do, and training, security awareness training along with these policies become kind of your baseline framework. And I emphasized, because I've seen it so many times, that this is a strategic initiative. We start out the year, or something happens, there's an event, there is a breach, and suddenly for the first 3 months, 6 months, it becomes critical path. There's a high sense of urgency. It's a primary priority, and we go for it. But then it kind of starts to dwindle away. That cannot be the case. This is something that you have to sustain. And I want to talk, and I'll go into the case studies here in a second. But it is continuous learning, because the threats are evolving and they're changing and they're growing rapidly, usually more rapidly than we can keep up with, whether that's the government or the private sector. So you want to create an environment where we're adapting, because the tools that we use in our business, including AI, are evolving as well. They're making us more productive. Our performance, our growth, everything is getting better, hopefully. At the same time, the threats are getting more sophisticated as well. So you don't want to lose the advantage that those tools give your business, but at the same time, you don't want it to increase your vulnerability. So you have to continuously evolve and adapt and evaluate. And that's not just in a document on the shelf. It's how you're continuously educating and keeping people aware. The feedback loop, if see something, say something type of environment where it's okay. Hey, I think I made a mistake. This is what happened. Or just, the constant escalation. There's a feedback loop. How are we doing on our security roadmap? What patches were done in the past 9 months or 3 months? How many people pressed phishing links in the past month? Those types of things are in that feedback loop. So a couple of case studies for you, and I tried to mix it up a little bit between financial services, manufacturing, and then I used an education example. So a very simple program to just improve password management at Princeton, and by getting people engaged and making them aware of phishing attacks and improving their password management, implementing multi-factor authentication, what they saw is a significant improvement in their audit results. And I mentioned that most of those organizations will audit. They'll say what percentage of people are vulnerable because they're pressing on these links, or they didn't understand and they made a mistake, versus what they were at the end of that. And what they saw over a period of 1 year was a significant improvement in the audit results. Again, emphasizing there's no 100% protection, but they dramatically improved the awareness. I took an example of a global heavy machinery company, and they had, of course, about 5 years been kind of doing the awareness thing, creating awareness, but they didn't really get serious about it until they went through a transformation. When they went through that transformation, they made it a strategic priority. They created a program, and what they found over the course of just 1 year. So for 5 years, they were seeing incremental results, but when they made it a priority within that 1 year, they almost doubled the result that they were seeing in terms of behavior from their staff. Same thing with the financial services company. It was a 6-year journey, and I emphasize the two because they both were going through transformations. It was really in that last year that they saw a significant improvement in the awareness, and it was because they made it a strategic priority. It's kind of like I have a growth strategy, I have an optimization strategy, and I have a security strategy. All of them were equal in importance. So I know I went through a lot, and I went through it in a short time. I want to pause here and open for questions. So let me see if there was anything posted. Oh yeah, we got some here. All right. Okay, so please discuss why prevention is impossible. However, conversely, please discuss why protection deterrence is 100% possible. Further discuss the probability of not if, but when of an attack. Further, please discuss organizations feel that it could never happen to them. Once it does happen, an attack, what are the regrets and lessons learned? Okay, that's a lot. Yeah, there's no 100% protection, no matter what you do and how much money you spend. Because it's not static, there will always be some level of risk and vulnerability. However, your protection and deterrence can be 100% in terms of what you've implemented holistically within your organization to address all the possible ways and threats, that the entire threat landscape. That can be 100%, and you can achieve those types of results if you're really serious about it. And it doesn't have to be as daunting financially as you might think. So it's really where you apply that budget and the resources versus just spending money to say I'm covered. Why organizations feel like it's not going to happen to them? I think it's I don't want to call it denial, but most organizations do have that sense of it hasn't happened yet. I do have a layer of protection. We're pretty careful. My IT guys are telling me we're good. They're staying on top of it. So it's not going to happen to me. I'm too small, or I'm too large, and we've got this entire security infrastructure. So I think it's that denial is probably the best word to use. It's just that you're living in a state of, because if you do a scan on your operation consistently, when we do what we call a readout for people, they will see they had no idea certain things were even vulnerable, or certain things were even there. So I think it's common that people think it's not going to be them. The reality is, if you look at the number of breaches, and the scarier part is, I think it was 67% of companies that have had a breach, 67% of those will get breached again. So it's a double whammy, right? And then the lessons learned is, we wish we had been more proactive. We wish we would have had a better understanding of the things that were the most important. In other words, you're not going to solve it all in one step. Focus on the high priority things where I'm the most vulnerable and work your way out from there. That way you're always zeroed in on what you're spending, why you're spending it, and then the bang for the buck. The regrets are obvious. There's a financial impact, and there could be legal and or regulatory impact in terms of fines. So essentially money that you had allocated for your growth strategy or just for your to run your operating costs for the next year are gone. So the regrets are, I wish I had paid more attention. It's kind of like car insurance. I hope I never have to use my car insurance, but I pay it every month because I don't want to regret. Well, it's a legal obligation, of course, but if I'm in a car accident or my health insurance, right? I certainly I don't want to regret not having had kind of those things in place. So I'd rather spend a little bit more, understanding I may never use it, but I'm going to spend a little bit more to make sure I have that protection. Shanti, with the AI, I think what I would do is I'm going to encourage people to, we'll be sending you out. We're going to have another one next month focused specifically on AI and what impact AI is having, both from a positive perspective and a negative perspective on cybersecurity. And it's hosted by an industry, by our partner, their chief solution architect. And he's going to talk more in a lot more precise detail on AI. So given the time, I'm going to kind of leave that one. Final question, at least the one that's posted here, is, does vulnerability letting down your guard increase after lunch? Well, it depends. Did you go take a nap or no? Yeah, I think during times of high activity, in other words, we've seen organizations where they have a deadline coming up in 3 weeks. And so the work is frantic and everybody's busy doing stuff. And you get an email that seems legitimate and you didn't just pause to verify or just take the time because things are the frantic pace. You took an action. The same thing holds true with, when your brain after lunch, whether you get tired, there are times it depends on your own biorhythms, but when you're tired, you're definitely, your cognitive ability to recognize something is going to be depleted. So I'm sure there are trends in that regard. Let me stop because we're right at the ending time. Were there any other live questions that we needed to address from people? Okay, so I'm going to put up the, if you want to get more information specifically on the security awareness training, you can scan this QR code. Again, I kind of want to close out by saying we're fanatical about encouraging people to develop and maintain and sustain their security awareness programs. We've seen it time over time. You've probably experienced it in your personal life, perhaps in your professional life. It is not going away. In fact, it's getting more sophisticated. So the more you make that an integral part of your strategy and a high priority, the better positioned you are going to be. In fact, you're probably going to end up spending less than what you will spend or would spend alternatively. And if it's managed properly, it from a financial perspective, as I mentioned, it's not as significant as you might think. So I encourage you to engage, reach out to us. I'm going to send this presentation. I'll post the YouTube video for you. If you have any questions, you'll get that you'll have my email and my phone number. So feel free to reach out. I'll stop for a second. Is there any closing comment or question? Okay. Everybody, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And you'll see the invitation, as I mentioned, for next month's webinar. And you can always go out in between and check out the huntley.com/video. Got a lot of content out there available for you. Scan the QR code if you want to get more information specifically on the security awareness training. I would be happy to talk to you about that. You can book an appointment with me and we'll kind of talk through your specific requirements. There's the QR code. Okay. I appreciate your time and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.